So our next speaker, without any ado, now that I got my schedule correct sort of thing, Dr. Haley Catton from AAFC Lethbridge on how to conserve beneficial insects while managing pest insects. Dr. Catton is a research scientist with Field Crop Entomology with AAFC Canada at the Lethbridge Research and Development Centre. She studies the impact, biology, and management of pest and beneficial insects with a focus on cereal crops. Haley's expertise includes plant-insect interactions, population biology, biological control, which is using insects to control other insects, and integrated pest management. Her current projects focus on wireworms, cereal leaf beetle, wheat stem sawfly, and beneficial insects. Welcome, Haley.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to be kicking off the insect hour right now, so this will be the best hour of the conference, right? We get to talk about bugs. Thank you for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? I can hear. Okay, great. Okay, so I am giving a talk on how to conserve beneficial insects while managing insect pests. This is a presentation I put together with my colleague Hector Carcamo. I delivered it at Agronomy Update, if you saw that a few weeks ago. This is a very similar presentation to that. And this is the title actually that they gave me, How To, and I'm like, oh, that's a really tough title to live up to, because there is no exact recipe book on how to do this. So my objectives today is to kind of frame the issues and the considerations and the concepts for you to make the decisions that work best for you. And to highlight new research developments. This is a really hot area of research around the world, and I've got a bunch of papers here that I will be citing as we go on, and I don't expect you to read them or anything, but if you are interested and you want to know what papers those were, I can give them to you after. And I also want to point you to resources, right? Because I'm going to be kind of giving an overview, but if you want more in-depth on any of these issues or questions, there are resources out there. Okay, so the outline for this talk is I'm going to talk about the broad concepts of what are beneficials and what do we know about them, and then kind of a two-faceted approach about how to conserve them within the context of your pest management system, right? And there's two kind of basic rules. Don't hurt them and try to help them, right? That's pretty basic, but what goes into those concepts, there's a lot of considerations for that. And then I want to present briefly some research and resources from the prairies and Australia, which is quite new, within a couple of years old. And then there's another thing I want to point you to. It's a report on the uptake of best management practices on the Canadian prairie farms. This is also a really hot topic of research of how are farmers making decisions and what decisions are they making and what may be holding them back, right? Legitimate limitations and concerns about why somebody may not be doing a BMP. Okay, so beneficial insects, agriculture, there's lots of different kinds of buzzwords out there. One of them I like is called eco-stacking, which is, there might be some jargon here, but promoting synergistic and comprehensive use of ecosystem service providers. So those are all the organisms in your farm that are doing stuff that we need them to do so we can keep farming. So examples are biological control, so the predators and the parasitoids, and pathogens of insect pests, for example. That's what I'm going to be talking about more today. But there's also pollinators out there. There's beneficial microbes in the soil. There's groups called soil engineers, right, like earthworms that are improving soil structure, water infiltration. And there's decomposers, right, the things that eat and poop and make those nutrients available for next year's crop. So there's a whole bunch of these things, and any management decision that you make, it's best to consider it on a holistic lens, okay, I need to do this thing, whether it's tillage or whatever, irrigate, whatever, right? But considering them in context of all these different things is where it's going to be the best decision. So they call that eco-stacking. Stack this on that, stack the beneficials on the soil microbes, think about it all. And then, of course, I don't envy farmers, actually, because you have so many decisions to make, and some of them are on the short time frame, right? And some of them are in the long time frame. Some of them affect your field. Some of them may have effects on regional pest populations, for example. So there's a lot to consider, and you know that more than me, but I'm going to try to give context to the insect parts. So what are beneficials? These are things that are out there already. So two main groups, predators and parasitoids, are out there in your field. every year. And the predators are like lady beetles. We've all seen those, ground beetles. This little brown one on the bottom is called a nabbit bug. They're predators. They're hunters. They're meat eaters. They're going to chase down your cutworms. They're going to eat grasshopper eggs, those kind of things. And they just kind of naturally exist. Then there's parasitoids. They also naturally exist, and they are really interesting because in their adult form, they're usually wasps or flies. You can see the little red circle there. That's an adult parasitoid, and it will lay its eggs inside of an insect host, like a cutworm, and then its babies will eat that cutworm from the inside out and torture it to death, basically, right? So these things are massively important, and they're tiny. If you can see in the picture how small they are, they're tiny, and they have different needs than predators because, actually, I wanted this list here. These are just a snapshot of our main crop pests that have parasitoids already out there for them, right? But they're different than predators because when they're adults, when they're in their wasp stage, they need sugar. They need nectar as food, right? And what do beneficials do? They kill pests. They scare them. They can change their behaviors. Things like cereal leaf beetles will drop off a leaf if it's scared by a predator, right? And they also eat and poop, which is part of nutrient cycling. If you want to know more about beneficials, there's an awareness program called fieldheroes.ca, if you've never heard of it. It's a website. There's field guides. There's scouting guides. There's lots of information. And if I'm flashing this too fast, you can email me afterwards, or text or call or whatever, and I can give you all this information. So prairie crop beneficials, there's so many. There's lots of diversity. And this is a slide from Hector because Hector, it loves biodiversity. So he wanted me to include that the biodiversity is super high. So the ground beetles, those are the hunters, right? You would see them every single day when you're out in your field, whether you notice them or not, they're there. And there's over 200 species of them in our prairie fields. And then you got 300 species of spiders at least. There's rove beetles, and then there's the parasitoid wasps. And a lot of this stuff isn't quantified because we don't know what's out there unless we look for it. So very common to find new species once you look for them. Here's an example of prairie biodiversity studies just with the ground beetles. Just a couple of recent studies, 62 species of ground beetles in Vauxhall plots over 4 years, more than 37 species in Lethbridge over 2 years, and then there's a study that my group did, we're just wrapping up, we found 82 ground beetle species. So lots and lots and lots. If we talk about parasitoid wasps, this is a slide from Hector's master student, Abby Pollock. She was sweeping in canola fields and looking for what parasitoids are in there. And don't bother reading the text, but it's just that pie graph is each color is a different genus, right? So there's one dominant genus, but there's a whole bunch of other ones too. Okay, so to give you a context of what beneficials are, that there's a massive biodiversity of them. Okay, how effective are they, right? If I was a farm manager, I'd want to know that. And so does the rest of the world too. This is a massive question globally, and the big question is how much are they worth? Like what is the dollar value of these beneficials per acre? And this is kind of my dream. It's kind of the holy grail of this kind of research. And there's a large body of literature on this. There's many, like every agricultural system in the world, there's somebody working on this, and there's lots of examples. But it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to quantify. Field studies are difficult when there's so many variables going on. And what's really interesting is when a problem is prevented, so say an aphid population is prevented from outbreaking because those ground beetles or beneficials are eating them, a prevented problem is an invisible problem, right? So there's a lot of work being done by these beneficials that we don't even notice because if it's not quantified, we don't know. And I'm going to show you a slide on that. Oh, yeah, these are just, it's also difficult to predict, and I wanted to do a little jargon alert here from a paper because I thought it was funny. This is a quote from a paper. A trade-off of generality and realism hinders mechanistic modeling across systems. So basically life is complicated, and there's so many variables. I know, it's kind of funny. Okay, so here's a prairie example of a biocontrol agent that we think is really impactful, but it's difficult to measure. So cereal leaf beetle. We have cereal leaf beetle here in southern Alberta. Hector and his group reared, multiplied, and released parasitoids across the prairies. And cereal leaf beetle problem isn't that big anymore, right? So we were nobody was out there measuring cereal leaf beetle infestations before and after He was just kind of trying to solve the problem. So we're going, okay, let's see if we can follow up where he released years later and see if the parasitoids are still there and what percentage they're killing their host. So these are very small numbers, but you can get an idea of the multiple release sites, and some sites, the odd one had nothing for parasitism, but most of them had half or more. So whatever few cereal leaf beetles are left, half of them or more were kind of secretly being killed by these parasitoids. And the follow-up monitoring was limited by we couldn't find the larva, right? So we call that a success, but it's not measured. So it's an invisible problem that got solved by a very small invisible insect. So just an example of how valuable these things can be. Because for cereal leaf beetle, the only other control is foliar insecticide. Malathion the only one registered. I know we all want to minimize the use of those organophosphates. So, okay, so the 2 rules of how to conserve beneficials. I'm always thinking about this in context of all the other things that you have to consider and when you grow crop and managing multiple pests. And I know you're busy and there's lots of demands. So the 2 simple rules, as I said, is try not to hurt them, which basically for our cropping system, the easiest thing or the lowest hanging fruit there is to avoid unnecessary insecticide use by scouting and using economic thresholds. And if you do need insecticide, right, you got to protect your crop, there are soft versions available that are less toxic to the non-targets, to the beneficials. Another little rule of thumb is separate the insecticides from the beneficials in space and time. In other words, my talk is not about pollinators, right? But one way to think about protecting pollinators is to not spray while they're out flying, right? Not during those daylight hours. And then rule number 2, help them, right? Remember when I showed that picture of that parasitoid, that little wasp in the red circle? That's the mom. She's laying her eggs in the pests, and she needs to eat sugar or else she'll starve. If she eats sugar, she'll live longer, she'll lay more eggs, she'll find more pests to lay her eggs in. And there's a thing called SNAP resources, which I'm going to talk about. I'm a little worried about my time, though, so I'm going to maybe skip over or gloss over some stuff. But integrated pest management, I like to think of it as a toolbox, right? Many of us think of it as toolboxes, a series of tools. You are probably familiar with some form of the IPM pyramid, where you have these multiple angles: cultural control, physical control, biological control, and then in theory, the very top, sort of last option is supposed to be chemical control. And so these are like different tools. And it's important to have different tools, because if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And I love this quote. I apply it to my life. But also, I think it really applies here. If all you have is a hammer, which might be foliar insecticide or seed treatment or something, then everything looks like a nail. Like you feel like you always need it. But there's these multiple prongs, right? And here's some examples: cultural controls, crop rotations, which I know most people do, resistant varieties, and then if you talk about physical control, there's trap crops. Biological control is what we're talking about today, which is the beneficials. And it interacts heavily with the insecticides, right? Because when you spray a pest, most of the insecticides we use are lethal to all those beneficials too. So I want to share some Australian resources. I think they're doing some really good work down there. They have something called an IPM checklist. Don't read the text. It's just like an info sheet, but it's kind of like things to think about. Pre-season, in-season proactive, in-season reactive, post-harvest, what you're planning. And I really like that they have proactive and reactive. So I would like to have something like this for our prairie crops. What we do have a lot of is what we call economic thresholds. So I don't expect you to read all this text, but this is just a list of main crop pests by crop, right? I got this from the Blue Book. I just compiled it. What we have is economic threshold. So an economic threshold is an insect or damage level where after that, or if things are more severe, it's worth spraying. It's worth your time. It's worth your money. If you have a few pests, but not that many, so pests below the economic threshold, you're wasting your time and your money because those insects wouldn't have done much damage. And you're spraying out your beneficials, which is a loss that's not quantified, but we think is probably huge. So here's a list of pests. Look at all these economic thresholds available. Don't read it, just look at the colors. Most of them are green or yellow. The green ones mean we do have an economic threshold, which means that's a decision point that you can use when you scout to decide if you have enough pests or not to make it worth the spray. Some of them we don't have economic thresholds. One of them is one of my pet projects, which is wireworms. And, you know, that's a big tool that's missing. So where to find these threshold infos? There's lots of sources. I'm kind of thinking maybe too many sources, actually. But there's the AAFC Field Crop Guide. There's the Blue Book, Crop Commission websites, provincial websites, Field Heroes Field Guide, and the Western Committee on Crop Pest Guidelines. So here's an example, a prairie example in canola. So you have cabbage seed pod weevil, you've detected it, you're worried about your crop, you go and scout, you do the appropriate number of sweep nets, and you find that there's cabbage seed pod weevils there, but less than 3 per sweep, which is the economic threshold. If you still decide to spray, you're not protecting the economics of that canola crop from cabbage seed pod weevil. And, I wish I had a pointer, but Hector here has outlined some beneficial insects that would be sprayed out. So the ones on the left are beneficials, and the ones on the right are the pests that they were going to be eating and killing. Oops. So kind of a, what do I call it? I call it like a accidental cost, right? Because you sprayed out these things that were going to do good. Okay, so economic threshold use. I was part of a study that I really liked with Emma Stevens, a bioeconomist. Maybe some of you were respondents, but of this survey, it was a survey of producers across Alberta, and we wanted to know how often they were using economic thresholds for which crop pests. So again, on the left here is just a list of crops, pests by crop, and then I'm going to show you the data. I haven't showed it yet, but on the left column is farms that hired an independent crop advisor. And the right column is farms that did not hire an independent crop advisor. And I'm going to show you the uptake or how they reported they used economic thresholds. So the dark bars are scouting and calculation economic thresholds. The gray bars are rough estimates. And the light, very light part is no threshold use. So overall, threshold uptake is really good, like around 80% for every crop pest, which is really great. People are out there scouting and making database decisions. But the people that hired crop advisors have more of the dark bar, which is scouting and calculation. People that didn't hire crop advisors have more of that lighter gray middle bar there, which is kind of a guess. So and the red stars on the other side are just the stats, but you can kind of see by eyeballing that people hired an independent agronomist were making more database decisions. Yep. Oh, yeah, no kidding, right? We are writing this up right now for publication, so it'll be, publicly available soon, I hope. Okay, so say you do the economic threshold and you do need an insecticide. Okay, well, I really like this picture, right? The whole house is brought down, but you got the spider. You can think the same way about the crop field, right? You may spray out your pest, but did you like crash your whole house or your whole beneficial population? So remember the quote, if all you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There's lots of different kinds of hammers out there. So I had some fun and I went into hammer clip art. And there's lots of different, there's lots of different clip arts, right? And you can get all kinds of different hammers. And you know, on the end of our extreme here, you got the sledgehammer, which for insecticide use would be analogous to like a broad spectrum, non-selective, long residual herbicide, just sledgehammering everything in your field, right? And then there's kind of a continuum, and you go all the way down to like jewelry hammers or watchmaking hammers, and even farther than that, you go down to tweezers. Maybe you just want to tweeze out your pests out of your insect population. And the tweezer would be like a narrow spectrum insecticide, or what people call a soft insecticide, short-term residues targeted on the pest group that you're interested in. Now, this is like a little bit idealistic. We probably don't actually have tweezers yet. In real world, I think tweezers might end up being RNAi. But in terms of insecticides, we probably have, maybe we're the third hammer from the right there, our best insecticides. But point is how do you find tweezers versus hammers, right? I've heard people say for years, use soft insecticides, use them. Okay, well, how do I find which ones are which? And the global entomology community has been on this for a while. There is a database. So this group called IOBC, International Organization of Biological Control, they've had for decades scientists like making databases of these insecticides for their toxicity. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go check that out. And it's not available. It's currently under revision because they're changing their rating system. But the rating system they've used, I don't know why my image is a bit cut off, but they have like green, yellow, orange, red. And this is based on laboratory experiments with beneficials about how many died within 24 to 48 hours. So it gives you a very coarse idea of like, okay, this is going to kill all my parasitoids within 24 hours, for example, if it's a red one. So the Australians took that, and they've done some really, really cool work, and they've developed a pesticide toxicity table for beneficials, and a whole bunch of other resources that I've listed here. But what I want to talk about is a paper that they just published. So this is 2024, right? Like brand new. And they tested these toxicities of these pesticides and the beneficials, and they did petri dish experiments, and they found a lot of nuance in terms of the IOBC classification is a little bit too simple because insects will die if lethal effects get worse after time. But they did find some main messages that some insecticides were consistently hard, as in broad spectrum, red, right? And some were soft. And even within an insect group, by species, that toxicity can vary. So they've made this table. So again, we have, actually, this time is different. The column on the left is different insecticides. Now, this is Australian. They have a little bit different ones than us, right? And then on the columns all along the right are different beneficial groups, like aphid parasitoids, egg parasitoids, whatever. They're just, you can just see it's a whole bunch of pests, and they've colored them green, yellow, red, based on those, their experiments and those petri dish experiments. So this is a resource. It's not Canadian. It's a little bit different. I would love to have one for here. That would probably take multiple years and research projects, but it's an idea, right? And they found, I think it was chlorantraniliprole, which is third row from the top, is mostly green for most of these. And then you see the squares that have a slash. So you say green to red or like a diagonal slash. That means that different insects species within that group, so different aphid parasitoids, were responding super different. So I would love to see that here. I'm going to skip this slide. This is about complications and nuance. There's lots of things that, like, this is a good start, but it's not the whole story. But I want to get to the how to help the beneficials. Remember, so we've been talking about how don't hurt them if you can help it. How to help them, you provide these SNAP resources. So that's alternate habitat, shelter, nectar, alternative prey, and pollen, right? So if you have that little parasitoid, she's going to lay her eggs in pests, right? But she needs to eat. She needs somewhere to sleep, somewhere to hide. Some of them need to eat for weeks before they can lay an egg in a pest, right? So they need a home. And, a cereal crop, for example, doesn't have any flowers or nectar in it. So here's some examples, right? And the photo here, by the way, is buckwheat. This is a buckwheat strip somewhere in the States. But buckwheat seems to be a really good source for parasitoids, for nectar. But here, just the examples of these SNAP resources are flowering plants, even weeds. I saw a paper yesterday that was called The Need for Weeds, which I thought was pretty cool. Aphids, when they poop, they have very sugary poop, what's called honeydew, and it's actually food for lots of beneficials. And ants, too, if you've ever noticed ants farming aphids. And it's good to have some pests around, because if you sanitize your field with no pests, then the predators have nothing to eat and they crash or leave, right? So you kind of want these like low levels of pests around. Okay, here's a prairie example. Still have a couple minutes, about 4 minutes. This is Brachycephaly. This is the parasitoid of wheat stem sawfly, and I know Lachlan, our next speaker, will be speaking about wheat stem sawfly. It's a pest that we're really interested in. It's been a pest here for 100 years or more, and this is its parasitoid. Now that's a penny it's sitting on. If you remember pennies, it's been a while, but it shows you how small that wasp is. Would an untrained eye see that wasp, right? It's invisible out there, but it is killing a lot of your sawflies. So sawflies are stem-feeding pests, right? Here's a picture of a larva. So the adult looks like a wasp. She lays her egg in a wheat stem. That larva feeds inside that wheat stem. That parasitoid will find stems with sawflies in them, sting them from the outside, paralyze that larva, and its baby will eat that larva alive, right? So it's actively preventing cutting in your field, but it's small. It's out there. Here's a picture from, I see some Bears Crew folks here. This is a picture from Ryan Dick at Lethbridge Palmer site a few years ago. This is just cutting, right? Like, we all hate to see stems on the ground like this, and those parasitoids will stop that. Here's a picture from a paper. It's very hard to see because they're both the same color, but the big, like the larvae are both, there's two larvae in this picture. They're both horizontal. There's a big one. You can kind of see its dark head capsule, and then the one in the yellow circle is just below it. It's small. That's the parasitoid eating that sawfly larva alive. The sawfly larva is paralyzed. It can't eat anymore or fight back. So what's my point? We have this system here. We think it's being we think it has potential to be increased, and lab studies in the States have shown if you feed these wasps sugar, they live longer. They have more eggs. Sometimes they have bigger eggs. So they're going to do a better job of preventing cutting. And also, when they overwinter in the wheat stem, some ways up in the stem. So if you cut your stubble short, they're not going to make it. But if you leave your stubble tall, then it gives them a chance to survive the winter, emerge next year, and get next year's sawfly crop. Well, sawfly crop, I guess you could call it. So what is the sugar? The sugar is like flowering resources. It's aphid poop. I've wondered if we could even put sugar sources in the field when there are no flowering plants. But we haven't done that yet, but I think it's a cool idea. Okay, my time's almost up. I'm going to flash this to you, this barrier to adoption. If you're interested in you are farmers. If you're interested in how farmers think as a collective, as a whole, what are your legitimate limitations? You say, well, that sounds good, but I can't do it because I'm too busy, or it costs too much, or I'm uncertain. This report quantifies that. So they talk about barriers, knowledge gaps. Here's the actual title of it. And there's 4 categories. I just have one slide on this. Economic, right? You need to be confident that this effort you're going to put in is going to pay off economically. Agronomic, so you need some kind of demonstrated benefit, maybe soil health, or maybe your farm equipment doesn't fit that BMP that you wanted to do. And these aren't just insect BMPs, they're all best management practices across the whole farm. Maybe you're too busy at the time you would need to be doing some work on this BMP. And then there's a whole social cultural component of trust. Do you trust this information source? Or is it does it seem kind of weird and out of the box, and maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you do? So I don't know, I thought it was very interesting. And then also there's a whole component of awareness that people may think they're doing that BMP, right? But they're not aware that it's not quite there. So one thing in regards to beneficials, one thing I was really proud of last year is that because of our work on this, we got an insert into the crop protection guide, so the Alberta Blue Book last year, and we even got a little cover circle there, new beneficial insect info. And the whole point of that was just to raise awareness that they exist and point people to new resources. So what we really need, though, to overcome these barriers is prairie-specific research on the costs and revenues of best management practices in general, but also like biocontrol boosting. And that's one of the things I want to do. It's like, okay, help you make informed decisions. How many parasitoids are out there? How much cutting are they preventing, right? Because then you can use that. Okay, and I have a conclusion slide. It's just repetitive, but that is the last one. So think about it. Eco-stacking, you want to stack all the good things up on top of each other so that you can win. How to save them, try not to hurt them, try to help them. Barriers to uptake, and then the future, I think we need to use our current tools better in terms of hammers to tweezers, right? And we need to develop new tools. Like, can we make tweezers so good that hammers aren't even appealing anymore? So if you have questions, ideas, discussion, you want to know more, please reach out to me. We're also looking to hire 2 university students this summer through a co-op program or internship program. So if you know a student, they need to get set up in the FSWEP, federal FSWEP program. We have very kind of strict government hiring procedures, but if they're a co-op student, it'd be even easier for us to hire them if they want to do this kind of work with us. So thank you very much.